So anyways, hello everybody. I'm about to start sharing my screen to introduce our live event for today, which is SASA Ask Author Book Club. So here we go. Thank you everyone for joining. So yes, today our Ask an Author book club is for the book Wolf Girl by Theresa Tomlinson, and it's hosted by Christian Casey, the Egyptologist. So just really quick, what is SASA? SASA stands for Save Ancient Studies in America. Our mission is to reverse the current downward trend in the studies of the ancient world by engaging the public and bringing together students and scholars to share their passion for the study of the ancient world in order to inspire a vast new generation of students. So of course, this is something we will touch on during the live event too, but basically in general, the idea is that we really need more people to be taking undergraduate classes, teaching ancient studies, things at lower level, like high school levels and stuff, so that more people get interested and keep taking it and keep having careers in it, so it will stay around. Where to find SASA? These are just our social media handles. We share stuff from our Inspire campaign, usually about 5 days a week, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And then all of our live events and some of our other cool videos we have, like ancient recipe videos and stuff, are on our YouTube channel. Just some protocol for our live event: be kind and respectful, listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event. Please remember that you can send in questions throughout the event. We want to hear from you guys. That's why we're doing this. Be patient with technology and people who are administering it already. Thank you so much. Sorry if people were waiting for us to go live. There are always fun technical issues. SASA live events are streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. SASA live events are recorded in archives, and the recordings are posted on the above platforms. And of course, have fun. Again, this is what the book looks like. I will be sending links to where you can buy it, which is either on Amazon, or you can order it to be directly printed from like a bookstore near you. And then we'll basically get into the event. I'll hand it over to Christian Casey. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Lauren, for the introduction. My name is Christian Casey. As Lauren already mentioned, I'm an Egyptologist. So my main area of research focuses on ancient Egypt. I'm also a postdoc at ISA, which is the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, which is affiliated with NYU. And my work there involves collecting and creating digital tools for the study of the ancient world more broadly, so not just Egypt, but all of the ancient world. And just on a personal level, I'm really interested in the role of historical fiction, the role of kind of narrative creation more broadly, and how it allows us to explore the ancient world and how it allows us to bring the subject to new audiences. So in my case, I've written and spoken a lot about Assassin's Creed Origins, the video game, and how effective that has been for both sharing the world of ancient Egypt to, potential future audiences of people who, let's say in a decade from now, might be my students at some point, where I'm, teaching them kind of at a more expert level things about Egyptian language and that sort of thing. But I also think it's really effective in how we as scholars think about the ancient world. That's how I ended up here today. We discussed many months ago creating a series where we could speak to authors of historical fiction. And Theresa Tomlinson was gracious enough to speak with us, and she, in our original conversations with her, she answered a lot of the questions that I have personally as a would-be author of historical fiction in my own area. And she agreed to come speak with us live. So thank you very much, Theresa, for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And the questions are open to, so anyone watching the live stream is free to drop in questions at any time. But just to get started, I thought I would ask Theresa some initial questions about her own writing career. So Theresa, what first inspired you to write historical fiction?
I think it goes well back to childhood. That I live in Whitby, and I grew up in the Whitby area. And really, from being very young, I loved coming to our town, which is such a historical place, with the ruins of the ancient monastery up on the cliff top. And really, from being very small, I remember being told stories about Abbess Hilda, who had a monastery up there on the cliff tops, and even sort of magical stories about her too, that she ridded the land of all the snakes and turned them into stone. And this is the explanation that we still have for all the ammonites that we can find in the rocks and cliffs near Whitby.
So the ammonites, which are these fossilized sea creatures, the story goes that that Sister Hilda those were the snakes and she turned them. So she's sort of like the St. Patrick of this area.
Absolutely.
And I just want to ask a couple questions just to contextualize our viewers. So when you describe Whitby, can you place that for us on a map of the world?
It's in the north of England, north of the Humber. It's in Yorkshire, North Yorkshire. So it's a seaside place with the River Esk. It's an ancient port. I mean, right, going back to Hilda's days, boats would have been coming and going. And we've still got one of the oldest wharfs is actually believed to have been built in some form or other at the time of Hilda, which was the 600s.
That's really interesting. So you still have some of the I suppose, wooden piers that would have been placed in order to create a wharf.
It would have been wooden piers then, and some of the piers still have wooden underneath. And so some of the timbers could be very ancient.
Interesting. And when you describe Whitby, you describe this hilltop monastery that would have existed very early on in the history of Christianity in the UK. So what was your experience with that place and with the history of that place growing up?
It was something that was always talked about. We still have streets that are named after the time of Hilda. We have a set of steps called Caedmon Trod, and Caedmon was one of the more famous people who are linked to St. Hilda. He was the cowherd who started...
And a character in your book, I should add.
Yeah, he is a character in my book. And he is now known as, in this area anyway, as the father of English poetry. There's a whole story about Caedmon, who was the cowherd and wanted to sing in the hall but daren't. But in a dream, an angel came to him and told him that he ought to go and tell Abbess Hilda and sing for her. And when he did that, Hilda was most impressed because he was possibly the first person that was able to make up poems and stories and sing them in the language of the people, not Latin, which of course most of the church services and songs would all be sung in Latin up to that date. And it didn't really mean anything to the ordinary people.
Yeah, and I've noticed that interplay between, it's a major theme in your book. And I think before we dig deep into those sorts of things, I was wondering if you could just sort of tell us about the story of Wolf Girl and how it then connects to your experience of history.
Yes, I mean, I think for a long time, I became very, very interested in the history of Whitby and the history of the monastery. And I used to, when I was a young woman, I used to read the Cadfael stories by Ellis Peters. I don't know if people know about those, but they're sort of detective historical detective stories that are set in a later date, but in the setting of Shrewsbury Abbey. And I loved those and thought, I was absolutely fascinated by them. And it occurred to me, somebody could write something like this about Whitby and about the time of Hilda. I didn't think at first that it could possibly be me doing that. I thought it should be somebody who was an acknowledged historian, an expert. But time went by, I grew older, it didn't happen. And in the end, I thought, why not have a go? And as at that time, I had been writing other novels for young adults, I felt more comfortable to have a go at aiming at the same age group, the same readership. I'm now pleased to say that quite a few adults seem to enjoy it too. So, I mean, I tried to use whatever I knew about the historical setting and the setup of Whitby Abbey, which Bede refers to a lot. He seems to be, although he wasn't actually on the same religious style of, as Hild, he still is very respectful about who Hild was and the things she did, and that she ran a monastery that she was in charge of with monks and nuns, which was a sort of quite a rare thing, I think, for a woman to be put in charge of monks. So I thought up some fictional characters to try to fit into this setting, and also to try to make it a kind of mystery adventure, hoping that that would be more exciting for younger people to read.
So Wolfram, the main character, she's one of your fictional characters that you placed into this setting.
Yeah.
And her adventure, I would say, sort of highlights, at least for an adult reader like me, it really highlights Hilda's achievement, because what's happening in Wolfram's world is really quite remarkable. It's the background to the events of the novel, of course, but it's really substantial. This monastery is kind of just emerging from the landscape, as it were, and Hilda is kind of just bringing all these people together and making this happen, and that provides a really interesting setting in which the sort of smaller scale adventures of Wolfram and her mother and the young princess, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment. What is the young princess's name?
Well, the young princess in my book I've called Elfled,
That's right.
Which is the simplest version of her name. I mean, her name is often Elfleda, but that's such a long, complicated name. And also other names are from the period are very similar to it. So particularly in this book, I tried to simplify these difficult Anglo-Saxon names as much as I possibly could. So Elfled was the young princess, and that seemed to be the simplest version that was also correct.
So she was a real person.
Yes, and she had her own dramatic story, because her father was King Oswy, and King Oswy was constantly fighting with the Mercian King Penda, and Oswy was a Christian and Penda was a pagan. And Oswy made a vow to God that if he could manage to kill Penda in battle, then he would give away his baby daughter to God, and that was Elfled. He did manage to kill Penda and win the battle. He then ruled for a little while over Mercia to the south, as well as Northumbria. And he did fulfill his vow and gave his baby daughter to Hild to bring up to be a nun. And in fact, eventually, Elfled became the abbess after Hild.
Yeah, that's a remarkable story. It has so many connections to stories that we could find really from any time and place. I mean, there's this Iphigenia quality to it that I find just sort of remarkable, where it's, of course, it's in a Christian context, but so much of the conflict and the notion of, you know, sacrificing your daughter and all those kind of things for divine grace. All of that is still in there. I didn't realize, reading your story, I didn't realize that component of it was true, that really happened historically. That's quite remarkable to me. Well, speaking in terms of the events of the book, would you like to sort of summarize the events for us and then say which things?
Can I read the back of the book? Because I think,
oh, if you like, sure.
I would find that an easier way to do it. Somebody else has written this, and this is an easier thing, I think, for somebody else to look at your book and summarize it. Gwen, a poor weaver struggling to make a living at Whitby Abbey, is accused of possessing a valuable necklace. If found guilty, she could be hanged, burned, or stoned. Wulfrun, Gwen's daughter, desperate to prove her mother's innocence, encounters lies and treachery wherever she turns for help. Set in a turbulent period of Anglo-Saxon England, this is a story of resourceful, dauntless heroine, determined and clever as a wolf. I like the idea of using her name and the idea of the sort of strength and craftiness of a wolf. Defying rank and convention, braving wind, weather and marauding armies, Wulfrun shows that courage has its own reward. So, I mean, it ends up with it's a sort of mystery, a bit of a detective story, to try and find out, to try to justify why her mother was the owner of a gold and garnet necklace, which was believed to have been of royal origin.
In the book, you make quite a point of the fabulousness of this necklace and the poverty of Gwen and her two daughters, because her brother, her father has died in I think a fishing accident, and they've been forced to sell her older brother, I believe, into slavery just to survive. And Gwen, Wulfrun's mother, is saving every single bit she can. I won't say penny because that would be anachronistic. She's saving every bit of wealth she can in order to buy back her son's freedom. And then she's in possession of this fabulously valuable necklace that is worth more than anyone of their station could have earned in many lifetimes. And then that's kind of the driving, the mystery that drives Wulfrun's actions, because of course she's found with this necklace because as a child she's playing with it and she gets caught with it, and so her mother is found out because of her actions and imprisoned. And there's quite a lot in here about what will happen to her mother. So what is expected to happen to her mother? Without going into too many gory details, like what are the legal consequences of possessing this thing?
I mean, this is difficult to know what would really have happened at that time. But I, looking at the sort of laws from the King of Kent, which is the only evidence we have really, seemed that kings were the decision makers mostly. But because Hild has been appointed kind of ruler in the area that she has her monastery in, I decided, I don't know whether it would be true or not, that Hild would be the person who could make the decision. And maybe it would be considered something like treason to have a royal necklace that you shouldn't have had. So I think it could be a death penalty. But Hild is away, and other people have all sorts of devious plans while Hild is away. And so there's a lot of detective work to do, and then eventually there is a journey to be made to go and find Hild and hopefully beg her mercy.
Yeah, eventually somebody just has to ask Hild, and that's kind of that drives the plot for a substantial portion of it, is just how are we going to just get to Hild and just ask her what to do about this. There's a notion all throughout that not only will she be expected to make the decision, but she is assumed by all involved to be the ideal person to make the just decision as well.
Yes, I think everybody trusts Hild. And I think that was, according to Bede, that would have been the reputation that she had. Hild was also a princess in her own right. She was related to the royal family. So she also had power of her own, I think.
Yeah. She certainly, she comes across as a powerful lady. I think a number of the subordinate figures to her in terms of the governance of Whitby Abbey come across as sort of grasping, as it were.
Yeah.
What's the word? Ambitious, but not always in a positive way. And there's a notion of Hild as being sort of the person you could trust to be the opposite of that.
Yeah. I mean, reading Bede, it did seem as though round about that time, the royal families of the different kingdoms, and even within the kingdoms, were all fighting each other and all trying to gain power from each other. So I felt that the sort of, although I've invented the devious plans that are going on in the background, I think it's not untypical of the time.
Yeah, and it's sort of necessary to have personal motivations tend not to survive well in historical records for the most part. So it's sort of hard to see. It's not always clear why so and so did such and such a thing at a certain time. So you normally need that personal component. Where I found, just from my reading, where I found the strongest sense of personality is in the character of Wulfrun, and then correspondingly in her foil in Elflead. So how did you come up with your understanding of their personalities?
I think it all started with Elfled. I was fascinated myself. There's no record at all of how Elfled felt about being given away as a baby to be a nun, with no possibility of her making a decision herself. And I thought that was a fascinating situation to try to imagine how would a child feel growing up in that situation. I think she had Hild as a guardian, which was probably a lucky thing for her. And I felt that Elfled was in a strange situation because she was a princess, but she was also going to have to be a nun, no choice about it. And I thought she'd be in a situation of being perhaps a lot of the population would have indulged her because she could be a powerful person, but also she would be expected to behave in perhaps a a religious and restrictive way. I think my idea started from thinking, what would it feel like to be Elfled in that situation? What would Elfled need? And I decided that I liked the idea of her having a companion who told her what was what, to restrict her when she thought that that was needed. And so that sort of started to develop the character of Wulfrun,
who is contrasted to Elfled in just about every way. You know,
yeah.
she has a great deal of personal agency with regard to her own life, in fact, despite being just desperately poor.
Yeah.
And that, you know, that creates an interesting dichotomy that I think it's one that we would find in many other stories as well, that having those two characters where kind of each one has the thing that the other needs most in this world to be complete. Certainly the case in those two. Is there any particular reason that you chose for the what's the word I'm looking for? Is there any reason that you chose for the drivers of the decision making in this story to be predominantly female?
I think that's something that probably goes through most of my books. I mean, I think it's just something that I feel more comfortable writing from the female point of view. And also feel as though maybe it's something that's been rather missing from history and from historical fiction. So
especially in this time period, we tend to think of this period of history as being so thoroughly male dominated. But of course, you have the example of Hild and her creation of this monastery,
absolutely.
Which, you know, she must have been a pretty tough lady. She had to be making.
So. I think so.
Yeah. I thought it fit really well, actually, with sort of subverting expectations a bit in terms of what we think this period of history looked like, in terms of you know, how patriarchal the structures were. But at the same time, there is this historical precedent. You have this powerful woman who is, you know, creating something out of nothing in this seaside village. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. Speaking to the secondary male character, so you've mentioned Caedmon already, and his in the book. So compare the character of Caedmon in the book to the historical figure. What did you create for him in terms of his character?
I gave him a slight speech defect, which the historical record from Bede says that he was teased when he tried to sing in the big hall where they had their big meetings and feasts and celebrations. And I think at that time it was very much the tradition for people who were confident and could sing, would play a harp and tell stories, and clearly Caedmon apparently tried, this is according to Bede, tried to sing in the hall but was teased, and in the end when the harp came round he would go and hide. So I tried to build a character around that I thought was a beautiful character and had real goodness, but actually had a lot of lack of confidence, and had a long way to go to become the Caedmon of history.
Yeah, I thought that worked really well. There's even mention in the book that when he sings, his speech impediment is absent, which is paralleled, I think, in the King's Speech. I think that's one of the methods. If you've seen that movie,
yes,
that's right. One of the methods that they use to
Yes.
That George VI had an impediment, and so
Yes.
when he sings, he doesn't have it.
Yeah.
So I thought that was quite interesting, because that I don't know much about that subject, of course, but it rung true for me as something that
Good.
tends to be generally true. And then there's also the character. There's the young scribe who helps Elfled. His name is Adfrith.
Yeah, Yadfrith. Well, again, I slightly simplified his name. Yadfrith was very, very loosely based on the real person who eventually created the Lindisfarne Gospels. Now, we don't know at all that he was trained at Hillsmore, so I've made him very young. We do know that he was trained later at Lindisfarne under Aidan would, I think Aidan would still be there, and also linked to Cuthbert at a later date. But it's a character just that I love, that sort of jumps out from the pages of Bede again. And I thought, we know that Hild had a scriptorium and also developed a school, initially for young men, I think, and maybe young women too. And so I felt that I just enjoyed really making Elfled's young tutor the very young version of Yadfred, who eventually became Bishop of Lindisfarne and is believed to be the creator of the wonderful, beautiful Lindisfarne Gospels.
Is that, I don't know anything about the Lindisfarne Gospels. Is that, can you tell us a little bit about that?
There's only one copy in existence, which is in the British Library at the moment. But I have actually seen it, because at one point it was sent to Durham, and there was an exhibition at Durham that you could go and see. It's the Gospels illuminated with wonderful patterns and drawings of animals that particularly relate to that part of the country around Bamborough and Lindisfarne Island, seabirds and animals, with the wonderful Anglo-Saxon curly patterns and shapes. And there are, I think they're called carpet pages at the start of each gospel, where you have a whole page that's illustrated and illuminated with, would have had gold leaf, and I think the gold leaf is still there, some of it. So a very wonderful thing that came from that period.
Sounds like a good thing for our viewers to take a look at when they can.
And you'd be able to find a lot online and lots of images from it online if people are interested to have a look at that.
Yeah, this is the sort of thing that in a SASA live class we would do some screen sharing and some Googling around. I believe we're limited by our technology in this sort of live stream, so that we can't do that, but just want to encourage all the listeners, go Google it and take a look, because it sounds like a wonderful thing. So that, I didn't know that before now. So that's where that character came from. He's known much later for this thing that he created.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. Okay, well, that's a pretty thorough view, I think, of the characters in the book, unless there's anything, is there anything I've left out, Theresa? Anyone important?
No, I don't think so. No, the character of Fridgith, who is the herb wife.
Yes, I left her out. Yes, she's so important.
Well, she's a very important character to me. The name Fridgith, it does appear in Bede, but she's just one of Hild's women. the name Fridgith is mentioned actually when Hild dies, that there's two nuns, Begu and Fridgith, are mentioned. Begu has a vision of Hild going up to heaven, and all it says is she went to tell Fridgith. And so I just took pleasure in using a name that was a real name associated with Hild at that time. But I also liked the idea that Fridgith was a pagan, cunning woman, if you like, and that when Hild had come to Whitby, she had cleverly, I thought, instead of sort of setting up a kind of pagan Christian rivalry, she'd seen that the local cunning woman could actually be invited into the monastery setting to become their herb wife. Because I think my version of Fridgith is she's skilled with herbalism, and she's sort of in a very simple way. So I brought Fridgith into this story, and then since then I've written 2 more books where Fridgith is the main character, more adult books.
Can you tell us about those books real quick so we can put links to them and encourage everyone to?
Yeah, I've got the Swarming of Bees is the first one that follows, and this is a lot about the Synod of Whitby, which was this huge meeting that took place with kings from all over UK and even from France, where they discussed the Celtic religion, the traditions of the Celtic religion, and the Roman style. And in actual fact, they discussed it and argued about it, and the Roman style won over the Celtic style. But I mean, I thought that's a very interesting thing to have happened, that Hild was invited to be the host of that huge meeting. And I think I love this story because it seems like the sort of thing that quite often Anglo-Saxons went to war about, but it was a very, very early time when they decided to have a meeting about it instead, and invited people from Europe and all over the UK, British Isles, to discuss this, talk it over, talk it out.
At Whitby too, which at the time was
yeah.
This was a very much a new up and coming sort of place. This wasn't an ancient hallowed hall where things had been decided for 1,000 years. The building had just been completed, presumably.
Not too sure about that, because some of the archaeology that's been done in the site at Whitby does show that it goes quite an important place, has some Roman evidence there upon the cliff tops, and also Iron Age, something like a chieftain's roundhouse. So maybe actually it was a more important place than we realise in the even before Hild went there. But then also the archaeology now is showing up a big community there round about the time of Hild, and certainly like something maybe a little bit like a university, where young scholars were sent to be taught and to learn. And there's evidence of metalwork hearths, weaving sheds, lots of weaving equipment. So actually Hild developed a big place there, I think. And maybe it would have had guest houses, perhaps considerable accommodation.
And I think it still stands kind of where I was aiming with that idea, is that they kind of trusted her to handle this. It's really a credit to what she had created there, that this meeting was being held. Although it is interesting for me to learn that the place itself has a much older history than I had realized when I read these things. Yeah, and I wondered about it quite a bit. Why this particular place? And the only conclusion that I could draw for myself was that Hild's esteem was so great in the minds of all these different people that they felt most comfortable hosting it there, which I thought is quite interesting. Back to the character of Fridgith.
Yeah.
Do you think that this is something that would have really happened? This marriage of a pagan cunning woman and the need to have a skilled herb wife in a place like
I don't know. This is where fiction comes in. It's the sort of situation that I wanted, and I mean, we don't know whether Hild would have made that kind of a decision. It's more the Hild that I want her to be.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's she's the Hild that we can admire for being very moderate in her approach to any sort of religious disagreements or things of that, and also very pragmatic. They need Fridgith in this place.
Yes. I think it would be a healing kind of thing, a healing decision for Hild to make, to include the people who were already living around the Esk Valley. If she could find them roles and include them in her community in some form or other. Yeah.
And avoid any sort of sectarian disagreement or religious disagreement and those sorts of things.
Yes.
I think I can't speak to the evidence for this time period in any part of Northern Europe, of course, because it's well outside of my area of specialization. But in the early Coptic period, and in the late at that boundary between the Pharaonic period and the Coptic period, we do see an awful lot of movement. And in stories like Beza's Life of Shenouda, we see lots of interaction between Christian and pagan groups. Some of it is violent, some of it is somewhat heated. Actually, a lot of it involves very real conflict. But I think between the lines, you can see an awful lot of cases where this transition is happening totally peacefully, and with everyone sort of just politely not acknowledging what's happening. There, many of the early Christian saints in Egypt have overtly pagan names.
Yes.
So the one that comes to mind is like Thebamon is an obvious one, that it's still it's the Coptic name. I think Pham is still a common Coptic name that comes from Thebamon, but his name is actually like Phoebe Amun. He has two pagan deities as his name, and it's sort of just uncommented on that a Christian leader would have pagan deities as his name.
I think there's quite a lot of evidence, if you look at it this way, that although Oswy of Northumbria was fighting against Penda, who was the pagan king of Mercia, at regular intervals they were having meetings and to discuss things, and at one point they intermarried two of their children, so that Penda's daughter married one of Oswy's sons, and one of Oswy's sons married Penda's daughter, and there was a lot of discussion about that. And although actually Penda, I think, is a really interesting character, although he was a pagan, he allowed his daughter to become a Christian in order to marry Oswy's daughter, and so Oswy's son. And he was very honourable in many of the decisions he made, he would not become a Christian himself, but he allowed other people to. And clearly, every now and again, they were trying to make some sort of a peaceful settlement between them. And then war seemed to break out again.
And you have to wonder whether it's simply the force is greater than any one person. Christianity was going to become the dominant religion in the UK. That seemed, at least it seems inevitable to us now, looking backwards. And you have to wonder whether anyone could have done anything about that, even if they wanted to. We have a question here coming in. How common do you think marriages like that were? They must have been.
Yes, I think they were fairly common between the British Isles were full of little kingdoms. There were lots of little kingdoms, and some were pagan still, had pagan rulers, and others didn't. One thing about the Sutton Hoo, the Sutton Hoo burial that was discovered, was that king had a pagan, who we think was Redwald, had a pagan altar and a Christian altar side by side, which is interesting.
He's hedging his bets.
Yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
And I think there was quite a lot of people having intermarriage between the different kingdoms, and sometimes people having to change their religion to suit where they were going. And the role that's called a role of peace weaver of some of the women who went as a bride to a different kingdom, I think was very important. Elfled's mother came from the Kentish kingdom, and her mother too, and they came as Christian women up to the north of England. And Elfled's grandmother was, I think, married to Edwin of Northumberland, of Northumbria, who was initially pagan, and he then changed became Christian in order to marry her and to please her, I think. And so Christianity was actually often brought up to the north of England more by the peace weaver brides.
Interesting. Definitely an interesting time period in history. It's leading me to wonder about a lot of things. One in particular that is unfortunately not related to your book, but I'll just mention it anyway, because I think Lauren's going to be interested in this. A new version of Assassin's Creed called Valhalla just came out, and it is set in a time period that I would say is fairly close to this one. I think there's definitely going to be the interplay of Christianity and pagan, Northern European pagan religions in there. So that might be something interesting to talk about in the future. I don't know yet. I haven't actually I played the initial tutorial. I haven't had time to play it yet. Anyway, but that's such an aside. I'm sorry to bring it up. But I couldn't. I can never completely get my mind off of Assassin's Creed, and it's just an obsession. So in terms of, you have obviously done substantial research on these subjects. When you set out to write your historical fiction works, what did you do in order to prepare for that component of it?
Yeah, right. I mean, first of all, read as much as I could. Lots of Bede is the most fantastic source. Without Bede's History of the English People, I wouldn't have been able to make up any of these stories. It's not always easy to read, and Bede does write from a certain point of view. He was pro-Roman, and he was writing at a later date than the one that we're talking about, but he was quite close to it. So you have to sort of read that and then think, and that's his point of view. So that's, I guess, the closest to a really original source, a primary source. But then the other thing that I've just loved, and I want to tell you about this, I don't know, do you know anything about the plan of St. Gaul?
I don't know.
No. It was found in I think it's France, I think, yes. And it's a plan for an early monastery. Now they think that the monastery was never actually built. The date of it is 700s. And a huge study has been made of the actual plan of St. Gaul by Horn and Bourne, and actually I've noticed just recently that it's published by the University of California, University of California. There are 3 volumes like this.
Okay, I was guessing that. I could tell from your hands moving off screen that you were like, you were heaving some enormous.
Yeah, it is huge. So, I mean, it cost a lot of money, but I decided this was essential for me to do this because the study kind of brings to life this plan for a monastery and all the buildings around it. The first book is all about the churches and what was planned for that. This is the second volume, which is the book that I just love. It's all about the buildings that would be set up around the monastery. And it's wonderfully well illustrated. I don't know whether I can show you very well the sort of pictures.
They have reconstructions of the buildings and the construction methods and everything.
The constructions, and it has, I mean, I'd like to just read out to you a few of the sort of things that are. And
Lauren, can we get a link to this work into the live stream some way too?
Like, for instance, the guest and service buildings, devices for heating, lighting, ventilation, baking and cooking, medical facilities, houses for workmen and craftsmen, house for the gardeners, monks, vegetable garden, cemetery and orchard, facilities for grinding and crushing grain, facilities for baking and brewing, facilities for raising poultry and livestock. So I hope you can see that this kind of helped me hugely.
Oh man, yeah.
Get a picture of what the community might have been like.
And how they did the things and all the things. So this is the thing I keep going back with. So I'm writing my own historical fiction, and like a book like that, you know, obviously I can just tell how valuable that is. Because there are so many things you don't realize until you start trying to write a story. Our lives have a lot of stuff in them. And if you don't know what that stuff looks like or how it works, it becomes really difficult to tell a story, actually. You need to know. Even things that I probably should have known as an Egyptologist, like how do people actually go about lighting a candle if they enter a dark room? I'm still not totally sure on what the correct answer is to that, but I found a number of possible. And you don't notice things like that until you start trying to write a story. And it's like, oh, they've walked into a dark room. They need light. What do they do next?
Do that? Sometimes I've gone round in circles with this because I was trying to imagine the sort of herb garden that Frigis would have.
Mhm.
And there's a wonderful herb garden described in this, but I thought, but this is for France and maybe different temperatures, different kind of soil. And then I know that there's a place in Jarrow where Bede's monastery was, which is a sort of museum visitor centre. And I heard that they'd made an Anglo-Saxon herb garden there. So I thought, right, I must go and see that, and that might give me more of an idea of what would have happened here in the north of England. And when I got there, I found it was based on the plan of St. Gaul.
Ah, yeah. It
So
makes sense. You know, if that's the information you have, then that's what you go
actually,
with.
I'm kind of doing all right.
Yeah, you're doing just fine.
Yeah.
And the books are wonderful. I think that kind of rounds out our
Yeah.
time for this
Yeah.
discussion. But
Yeah.
Lauren, I was mentioning to you, obviously, let's include links to all of Theresa's work so that people can go and find the books. And the book that you just mentioned, that you just held up, you mentioned the name of.
Yes, I mean, this is the Plan of St. Gaul, and there's 3 volumes like that, and it's by Horn and Bourne, and it's California University Press. I mean, these books are quite old now, I think.
It looks like a wonderful resource for anyone who wants to research this time period.
Fantastic, fantastic. The earliest date is 1868. This version is 1979.
Yeah, I think that will be a wonderful resource for anyone who watches this and wants to dig in more to your sources, especially upon reading the books. I think people, that's one of the advantages of historical fiction, is that you read the book just because it's a nice story and you find the setting pleasant to spend time in, but then you're inspired. You have to go learn more, and that's where you need a book like this to go really dig into the background. So yeah, I think that's wonderful to share with our viewers. And just I think I can speak for everyone here, for Lauren as well, in saying thank you so much, Theresa, for coming and talking to us. I have so much enjoyed reading your books and getting the chance to speak with you. I know I'll have more questions as I go on in my own writing journey, but very grateful, both from myself and behalf of our viewers.
Thank you for having me. And I felt nervous about doing this, but you've made me feel very comfortable, and it's been an exciting thing for me to do.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you so much, Theresa.